So we've been describing everything we've been drawing with line so far. The single line that gets the entire shape in one go, but I want to switch it up and be a little bit more painterly. I want to talk about working with shape as the basis instead of line. Some people find it more natural to think about things in terms of solid structural shapes. It's certainly more painterly. It looks more three-dimensional, like photographic slightly, the representation of the world as masses. So in this lesson, to talk about this, we're going to be drawing with shadow shapes, breaking things down with a brush pen and making solid blocks. And then we'll go a little more complex and go into those shadow shapes and see texture, detail, build those shadows with mark making, like pen hatching. So we have those silhouettes, but there's information inside them. And then I'll touch on an alternate approach. Another way that you can think like a painter is to draw with water-soluble ink. And that allows you to make the silhouettes that I'm going to show you with wash, just by blending out your drawing. So so those are the things we're going to cover in this topic, and on to some examples. So we've moved to Havana. First exercise was in Newfoundland. So here we have a couple of street sort of scenes from Havana, Cuba. And I've been drawing these sketches we're going to see here entirely as silhouette shapes. Just the brush pen breaking down reality into solid masses. So this is the exercise. This is the core. It only uses one color, one tone, and one tool. And you can do these quite small, just working in a sketchbook, and you don't have to do the entire thing. You can focus on a subject like a statue or just a doorway. But the idea is to represent all the complexities of the tone by just looking at the shadows. So that's the process, or that's the goal that we're going to try here. So let's try one, and you can see how I go about it. So I've got a photo reference up here of another scene from Havana, the famous old cars that we see in the 1950s cars that they still drive around. It's very distinctive of the environment. When you find a little storytelling one shot, that would be the postcard shot. It always makes me stop and get my sketchbook. This is the one thing, if I come with this drawing, then I'm going to remember what it was like to be there in Havana. But it's also a subject that I chose because it's got nice silhouette shapes of what's lit and what's dark in this car body. So I'm just going to give myself a little square to work inside of. I like to have a little bit of a framework, and you'll see me draw these little dots. They're just things I do to real basic kind of measuring. And it's just a matter of starting at the most interesting thing in your drawing, whether it's the tower on the building or a statue you want to draw. And in this case, it's the car, and beginning to block in that shape. So I'm just going to dive in and get started. So the thing that you're doing here is looking for anything that's even close to the shadow side that you can simplify and turn it into a solid black. So the entire backside of this car is in that shadow shape. But then the stuff that you leave out as you're working, there's a little bit of there's a fender, kind of a license plate thing going here. Then we hit the next wing on the back of that car. So this is kind of the butt end of the car that I'm building, and it's going to lead through the tire into the shadow that's cast onto the ground. So here, see how that shape just begins to appear by working the silhouette, connecting it together. Everything that's in the shadow, of course there's a lot of tones in there, but by doing this exercise of simplifying it, it really trains your eye. And it's also training your brushwork at the same time. It's a very compact kind of, this little brush game is a very compact kind of way of training yourself to paint. You're doing all the things that you're going to eventually do in a more complicated painting with this one tool, just working in a small little sketch like this. So it's very handy for practicing everything at the same time. There's a little bit of glinting light on the side of this car, but I want to get how there's wheel wells. So a little bit of concentration to get that shape. See how the side of the car begins to form. So an instructor that I studied with, I took a classical painting course in Montreal, and that fellow used to say it was like when you place a boot print in the mud and your boot goes down, you've embossed this design in the mud, and just imagine the water filling up your boot print, coming up through the mud and making that shape just appear magically. There's the shadow under the car. Now, not every part of the drawing has to be that complex, but just what I left out makes the fact that the hood is facing up and catching the light. Not every part of the drawing has to catch every kind of detail. You want to look for, I like that steering wheel and the fact that I can see through the car, see through the windscreen of the car. But then I've simplified out quite a bit on the back side here. And then when I get to something like the side of the building here, this is just a really bold, simple shape. There's a traffic sign here and some sense of there's eaves. So see how fast this is that you're just placing in the environment with kind of very rapid little sketches. There's a bus back here and a person, and this is called welding a shape. There's a guy on a bike here. I'm not even capturing any of that, just that there's some kind of noise, some kind of little brush marks back there. And in the distance, we have some buildings. So I'm sort of looking at, it's a diagonal line. These buildings come in. I might do a few of those dots. You saw me making these little dots every once in a while. This is the kind of measuring that I might do when I'm doing an ink drawing. I don't want to take the time to do a pencil drawing underneath, but I do want to maybe sometimes place some little markers, like here's the tip of the tower. So that tower that's out there, it's a church in the distance down the street. And just by placing where's the top and where does it hit the ground, then I can figure out that shape. And I'm just leaving these little gaps that represent bits of light where the light is cast. And it's almost like by instinct. You'll just get better at that over time. The more you practice, the more it'll come naturally. And the mass of this thing is windows and balconies, little vertical and horizontal things that just form a cube that has interlocking lights in it. But what I want to do is leave out the lid, the roof of this car for sure. So when I bring these buildings down, I'll bring them down, but I don't want to obliterate where the roof of that car is. That's kind of an important bit to build the road. So see how the silhouette is just beginning to expand, like that analogy of the boot print? Let's see, the rest of the road is casting a shadow. There's a shadow on the road here with the other buildings. And I can draw the edge of the car by where these two shadows meet. And I have kind of dark archways. This is like a big balcony and sheltered walkway in there, which is actually 2 stories. So as I look at the world, I'm just looking for where are the dark shapes out in the world, how do they connect, and how can I simplify them? And there's a whole big shadow shape in here. It's the side of this building, kind of comes up like this. And then I'm going to do some point work to make the little windows in the fronts here. Very abstract. This is just brushwork. So see how this is the simplest kind of possible painting. Just like we started with the simplest kind of line drawing. I like these exercises that train the thinking, the way you're going to approach a drawing in a painterly fashion, and give you a really quick in and out opportunity. If you practice this sort of thing, how to look and simplify with this almost like calligraphy, this will really help you get the scene quickly, really get down to the essence of what you're looking at. And it's the kind of thing that I like to do while I'm on location, for sure, kind of little travel notes. But the next step is taking this kind of silhouette and adding the complexity of what's going on inside those shadow shapes. But practice this first, and then we'll get on to the next bit. Looking at slightly more complexity into the shadows. Here's an example, another shot of a car. So here is that car with the shadow shape seen with some texture inside it. So there's stuff going on inside a mass like this. You could interpret it as just the black shark shape of the car, but really there's stuff going on like the driver that can be seen in the window, and the glints of metal on the tires, and then the passage of the vehicle itself, the side-on view of it. So in this example sketch, see how all the lines run parallel? This kind of textural mark, that's just made with the pen, shading across, thinking about that whole silhouette in the same way as I did with the black shape, but filling it with line, with mark making. And so there are opportunities for texture here. We can build that shape with those little leftover white holes. We can make linear direction. We can use thick and thin lines at the same time. So that, like in the tailgate of this car, we have some boulder line and some thin line working together, or the texture on the road. So this is a shadow shape that's got some complexity in it. Here's another example. So this is in the cemetery in Havana, which is a fascinating place to visit if you ever go there. Incredible sculpture and architectural models everywhere. So this is again the example where foliage is always the darkest thing. And then in a building, we have a light and a dark side. And even if it's a cloudy day like this, you can interpret from visual clues and push one side to the light and one side to the dark. So I've broken my shadow shapes in this little sketch down into the big masses front and side, and the shadow kind of inside the entranceway of that building, and then the trees, which have a combination of the brushwork and pen work. So see, like in this tree, how there's many different kinds of pen marks that change direction, lots of different angles and different weights of line. So that's kind of an important thing when you're building these shapes out of pen line, is that you want to use parallel lines where it's going to create a smooth surface, but then interesting gestural movement-shaped lines in natural organic forms. Or say, for instance, in the clouds up here, it's a shade and it's made with marks, but it's a very light, high-key kind of shade, and I wanted to keep all those marks in a directional flow. So I'm thinking about these kind of things when I look at my shadow shapes. Instead of just growing them to be a solid, I want to grow them in a way that provides internal description. Like in here, there's little scribbles that imply the carvings. So I'm going to take one on and let's see it happen. This example, this is the sort of big town square in Old Town Havana Viejo. So it's a complex scene for sure, but I would approach it the same way as I would any of these kind of things with my 5 to 7 lines. Okay, so when I look at this scene, I see the light and the dark sides very clearly on these buildings. It's more sunlight in this shot, so that's better. So we know that there's going to be a whole passage of tone that's on every other alternating side. But then I also have all the work that's underneath the umbrellas and that space of shadow in there. Now these umbrellas are a visual challenge. They're definitely super duper complicated. And the church is what's interesting to me. I love drawing old architecture. It's kind of gets the ambiance for me. So I'm going to focus your eye in that direction. But let's just start with some of these big masses of tone. So when I'm doing architecture, I'm really thinking a lot about parallel lines, because the surfaces have they're smooth surface. They're man-made smooth surface. So I like to use a lot of either verticals or horizontals, like I did with the car, but probably verticals in a building. So think of it like you're creating a tone with density, with relative density. So if your marks are closer together, then the tone is darker. And if they're farther apart, then you get a lighter kind of effect. And I want to just keep these shapes gradually solidifying. So remember that analogy of the boot print? It's gradually filling. That square of the side of that building is gradually appearing. And I can slightly reinforce the corners of these shapes, a little bit darker tone. Or I can go into a place like the buildings here and make or the windows in the building, excuse me, and make a much denser set of marks. So see that shape appear in there as I get in tighter. And that's just a matter of tightening up momentarily and making closer spaced little pen marks. You can take it right through the whole side of a form and just very quickly separated the light from the dark. So if you're thinking a bit ahead about that previous exercise that you did with the brush, having done plenty of those little brush pen drawings, you start to think, how does the world break up into light and dark? So you want to be able to look at a scene and see where those dark shapes are, see where those patches are, and it just starts to come naturally what I want to fill. So now when I'm creating a tone, it's very subtle, the idea of tonal gradation. I have a horizontal line There's a little kind of cupola on the roof, and there are these seams in the side of the building. There are ledges in the side of the building. So I want to come up to those and darken them a little bit. It's just like going in with a paintbrush. So it's the other form of this painterly thinking, that now I'm thinking about value as well as shapes. So it's like going in with a paintbrush and making a gradation of wash. So here's a shape here. There's a roof behind the top of this church. There's another one back here. It's the back half of the building. So by filling that silhouette, it sort of pops apart from the object in front, right? So those are the kind of things you're looking for in tone. This ledge, these are big doors. And in the drawing, or in the photograph, you can see there's a lot of architectural detail in here. So it's going to make these shapes. Like I'll just draw the shape. It's going to make this cast shadow shape. So I'm thinking about that as I put my hatching in. I'm thinking about the shadow that I want to fill. So underneath ledges, inside doors, I make this tone. And you want to make a nice clean kind of tone shape that, see how it goes to I'm hitting the top of the umbrella here. And I'm trying to hit the ledge that's casting the shadow. And there's that tone shape. And it appears as a solid form, or it's starting to solidify anyway. And you can look into these things and say to yourself, where do I need a little bit more tone to make an edge meet nicely? Sort of seal up those patches as you go. And always inside shapes and underneath shapes. And there's the light. Oh, here's a good example. I should catch this edge and stitch that in. So now the side of that tower meets the zigzag of those umbrellas more accurately. So that's the general approach. I would, of course, use this is the original finished drawing. I would, of course, use the brush pen to come back and catch the even darker darks. But I want to show you a more complex example than this. There's a lot going on in here, which I simplified into just flat tones because it's architecture. There's a lot of smooth gradients in a thing like this. And that was all done with just the fine line pen and the brush pen that we've been using so far. But I might want to use more complex kind of mark making, like what I was talking about in the foliage. So I have another example here with some trees. This is there's my reference material. It's an old fort that's on the side of the old town, very near that church. And we have some water and foliage, interesting things going on in there. So if I go back in time to where my line drawing, kind of looks like that, right? So if we look a minute at how I broke the world down into lines, the masses of the foliage have just very simple outlines, where the water is a clear shape, but it's just an empty vessel waiting to be filled with tone. So that's the perfect expression of that single line drawing. And now I'm going to dive into these trees. Mainly I'm going to work the foliage. So now I'm going to think about patterns that are fan-like, sort of organic curvature to create the sense of leaves appearing. And every once in a while, as you're working, switch up to a bolder pen. This is a flat, so see how much more ink I get with a single shape with this kind of thing. And this allows me to go in and do stuff like bold marks on the windows, similar to what I would do with the brush pen, but it's just a slightly different language. So this is a kind of controlled scribbling. And it's something that I sometimes call knitting. That when I have a line drawing and I have all this texture to fill, it's a lot slower, right? We were talking about speed of execution, but I have a lot of marks to make here to fill all this foliage. So it's going to be a slower kind of activity. It's the kind of thing that I might save and do in the car when I'm going home, or even on the plane. Any kind of spare moments while you're traveling. Say you've ordered dinner and you're waiting. I'll pull out my sketchbook and I'll start. It's like pulling out my knitting to have something to do whenever I'm got some downtime. So that's kind of the way I approach this sort of hatching, saving it as a fun little project to do. Because one of the things that was really important to me about talking about travel sketching is sort of thinking like, how would you actually pull this off when you're out there in the field you want to come home with a book full of drawings, but there's always stuff happening. Like you got to catch your plane to the next town, or you got to relocate to the hotel, or more commonly, the family wants to do something. So this idea of building yourself these simple sketches that you can work on in your downtime, that's very key to finishing your whole sketchbook. It's sort of like when you get home, you have to sort out your photo album. You know, you want to flip through your sketchbook and find what are the things I really want to make sure I captured. You know, which scene did I like the most? So I just put in, there's a little kind of wall back there, but I wanted to really separate it from these two buildings. So I just put in a really dark tone to represent that wall. What I need to do is get to these trees in front. So here, these guys back here, they're more of a silhouette, right? These trees are pretty much a solid shape. These guys, I'm going to try to get into the interior shape a bit. So every big canopy mass to a tree has kind of a light and dark pattern. It's casting shadows on itself. So these are the kind of things where you can make little leaf-like marks. You can have fun with the design, but also think about unifying that overall structure at the same time. So how do I do both? I think about an area that's a passage of marks. See how I'm curving these marks as I go and making them a little bit as interesting as possible. I think about a passage of marks that represent the cast shadow. And then I think about the edge of that passage. So I've made a tone shape. I made a silhouette there. And then I might do leaf work just right around the edge of that. So you have an edge, you have a mass with an interesting edge. Here's another mass in here, but I might get in and do some leaves around here, make this edge interesting. So it's how do the shapes interlock and how do they transition from one thing to another. So between the water and this little wall, I might want to emphasize where the base of these walls are. So I'm going in with the brush here to just get some big solid dark in. Water should always have flowing kind of marks in it. So when I have a tone shape like that, I'm thinking about tone and then transition out of that. Think of it like every shape should have an interesting edge. So how does the sense of the waters flow? And how do I harness that single line scribbling that I'm always doing? Here, put a bit more. So you can sort of say, and a thing needs some shadow because there's a cast shadow here. You just look at your drawing and say, what is the next largest dark shape that I haven't handled? So it's still these trees up here in the foreground. But what is the next largest dark shape that needs a passage of tone? And I just keep subdividing from the big silhouette into smaller shapes inside. So see how the direction of all the scribbles come together to start to look like trees? I don't really ever get in to draw individual branches. I'm just thinking about I'm thinking about it in terms of painted tone. So if I was going to do this in watercolor, there'd be all these variations of green and yellow and brown that make a tree. But they're all happening inside that silhouette shape. So see how the different kind of mark making, I'm alternating back and forth, not being repetitive. In the buildings, I was always worried about parallel lines. So say for instance, shadow side of this. I have a little kind of railing up here and it's casting a shadow down. So parallel lines in the buildings. Well, there's a dark one back here. Parallel lines out there. But organic lines in these tree shapes, or if you were doing people, clothing, fabric. So the language of the line starts to work together. And you can see how this is starting to look more painterly, right? It's starting to look more like that I'm leading the eye with the marks into the distance, that I have texture going on in all of these buildings, that I might start to get information like inside here, individual bricks and the cast shadows maybe. I can just add more and more and more detail with this hatching. There's really, you could keep going until you've covered the entire page. But that's an example of that idea of knitting, that you get as much as you need on the spot to remember where all those shapes are, and then as you travel, you continue to revisit your paintings and continue to sketch on them until they're more fully fleshed out. So that's pen mark making. That's silhouette shapes. But inside those silhouette shapes, you can have a lot of fun with the variety of mark. There is another way to approach this. So I have an alternative. I consider it sort of a step between drawing and painting, which is to use water-soluble ink. So in this shot from another section of Havana's cemetery, here's just how this is going to work. I did a line drawing in the fountain pen ink, and you want to look for something that's called washable ink. Water-soluble, but fountain pen makers, they call it washable. So in this kind of drawing, when we apply the color, or the water, it just melts the ink line. It'll pull some tone out of that ink line, and you can control where the tone is going to move by what you touch with water versus what you don't. So it's a way of converting a drawing to an instant set of those solid shapes, just like we did with the brushwork, but by blending it out of your drawing instead of building it up. So it's an alternative way to think about those silhouettes. So let me just quickly show you one. I have this drawing, another set. This is the original art, and here it's just a very simple kind of environment where we have, again, the shadow sides of the building. So I'll just show you how the line works here, or how the water effect works. Everything you touch with water is just going to melt a little bit and pull out a little bit of color. So you can use that effect to convert your drawing into kind of a watercolor. And the more dense the pen mark is, the more tone you're going to get out of the line, right? If you have a lot of pen hatching, you can get a pretty dark tone out of it, or a darker tone anyway. So I'll just use this to do my drawings, that single line drawing, the way I always approach my sketch, but knowing that I have this ability to pull tone out of it later on. It's kind of a little magic trick that I enjoy. And you can unify your shapes as you go, just sort of seeing what is in the shadow space. Remember, I'm always talking about that. What is in the shadow space versus what is in the light. I will often carry some paper towel with me, so you can lift a little color by blotting with the paper towel. It's an important drawing tool, the paper towel. But that's how simple it is to modify your drawings with a little bit of water to create that tonal side. See how the painting aspect can just be almost instant. It's really kind of neat how fast it can be, just converting your sketch to what are those big masses of tone. It's the side of that's facing away from the light. These are all the things that I would hit with my brush pen. And the cast shadow that's on the ground in the foreground. And you get these beautiful spontaneous effects that just come out of the line flowing with the water. So it looks a lot like you'd painted it originally in watercolor. Isn't that kind of a fresh effect? I like that as an alternate way to build up those shadow shapes. So there's two different kind of approaches there, to build them positively or to draw them out of the lines. So, for your homework, to practice this kind of thing, I think it'd be great to go back to some of your single line drawings that you have in your sketchbooks. Hopefully you've been trying even multiple tries at a particular scene that you want. You might have 3 or 4 variants left over. So you can go back at your drawings and try building those tones on top of it, either cross-hatching with the pen to make those different kinds of mark making, or taking your brush and just building solid shapes. So try that on some old drawings and then go out into the field and do your brushwork directly. And then at some point you might also want to try this alternate approach. So, yeah. So in the next lesson, we're going to go over, well, we've gotten up to this middle step, and we're going to actually go to tinting your drawings with watercolor, to painting over the sketches.